Billionaire yells at Black Waitress. She replies with one sentence that shocks everyone. He opened his mouth to fire her, to ruin her life over a single, clumsy mistake. But the words she spoke back weren't a fear or apology. They were a key, unlocking a memory he'd buried for 20 years. And in an instant, he wasn't a powerful billionaire anymore. He was just a father, staring at the child he left behind. The silence in Julian Croft's penthouse was a manufactured thing, an expensive, curated emptiness that cost more than most people's homes. It was the sound of polished marble floors that swallowed footsteps, of triple-paned glass that murdered city noise, of air scrubbed clean by a humming, invisible system. At 52, Julian had achieved a level of wealth that allowed him to control his environment down to the last particle of dust. Control was everything. It was the armor he wore, the air he breathed, the God he served. He stood before the vast window overlooking Central Park, a stark silhouette in a tailored suit that cost more than the car his assistant drove. His knuckles were white where he gripped his phone, the screen illuminating a face carved from granite and impatience. "No, Reynolds, adequate is not the word I pay you $250,000 a year to use," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Adequate is what happens when you settle. I don't settle. The deal closes by 5, or you'll be finding out just how adequate your severance package is." He didn't wait for a reply, ending the call with a vicious tap of his thumb. He placed the phone on a glass table with such precision it made no sound. His gaze swept the room, the minimalist furniture, the muted color palette of grays and blacks, the single, abstract painting worth 8 figures. Everything was in its place, perfect, orderly, and yet a chaotic storm raged within him, a tempest that no amount of money could tame. His eyes, almost against his will, drifted to a silver frame on his mahogany desk. It was turned away from the room, facing the wall. He hadn't looked at it in years, but he didn't need to. He knew the image it held. A little girl with a gap-toothed smile and eyes that held the same fire as his, sitting on his shoulders, her tiny hands tangled in his once dark hair. A ghost, a memory, an unbearable failure. He squeezed his eyes shut, the muscles in his jaw bunching into hard knots. The past was a disease, and he was determined to outrun it, even if it meant becoming a machine. Miles away, in a cramped but vibrant 2-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, the silence was of a different sort. It was a warm, lived-in silence, punctuated by the gentle sigh of an old radiator and the soft rustle of starched linen. Imani Wallace, 28, moved with a quiet efficiency that was a form of grace. She smoothed the crisp white shirt of her uniform, the fabric a testament to her meticulous care. The apartment was small, the furniture second-hand and worn, but it was immaculate. Sunlight streamed through a clean window, illuminating a collection of mismatched mugs on the counter and a row of thriving green plants on the sill. She glanced toward the closed bedroom door, a soft smile touching her lips. "Mama, I'm heading out now," she called, her voice warm and melodic. A frail, sweet voice answered from within. "You have your bus pass, baby?" "Right here in my pocket," Imani said, patting her slacks. "And I left your dinner in the fridge. All you have to do is microwave it. Don't you be trying to use the stove." The door creaked open, and a woman with skin like delicate parchment and eyes full of fierce love shuffled out, leaning on a walker. "You worry too much, child. I raised you, didn't I?" Imani walked over and kissed her mother's forehead, her hand gently resting on her fragile shoulder. "And you did a wonderful job. That's why I have to take care of you now." She saw the flicker of pain as her mother shifted her weight, the arthritis a constant, cruel companion. Imani's Kluchek from Aria, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, barely covered their rent and her mother's ever-growing pile of prescriptions. Every shift was a battle, a tightrope walk of balancing exhaustion with the need for tips. But she never let her mother see the strain. For her, she was all smiles, all strength. "You be careful tonight," her mother whispered, her hand finding Imani's. "Those rich folks, they can be unkind. Don't you let them dim your light." Imani squeezed her hand, her resolve hardening. "They can't touch my light, Mama. It's fireproof." As she rode the long, rumbling bus from the Bronx to the heart of Manhattan, the city transformed around her. The brick and graffiti of her neighborhood gave way to the gleaming steel and glass of Midtown. The people changed, too. The tired, communal faces of her neighbors were replaced by the sharp, hurried, and entitled expressions of the city's elite. It was a world she served but could never belong to. It was a world she entered 6 nights a week, a world where she became invisible, a pair of hands to pour wine and clear plates. It was the world of men like Julian Croft. Tonight, their 2 worlds, one built of sterile control and the other of resilient love, were on a collision course. And neither of them knew that the impact was about to shatter everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. What do you think separates a person's true character from the persona they show the world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Aria was a cathedral built to worship money. The ceiling soared 2 stories high, adorned with a constellation of crystal chandeliers that dripped light onto tables draped in heavy white linen. The air was thick with the scent of truffle oil, vintage Bordeaux, and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. Waitstaff moved like specters through the dim lighting, their faces trained into masks of serene deference. This was Imani's stage, a place where her identity was stripped away and replaced with a crisp apron and a number. She was table 12 tonight, a ghost refilling glasses and describing the pan-seared scallops with a practiced, poetic detachment. She was good at it. She could read a table in seconds, knew who wanted to be fawned over, who wanted to be left alone, who was trying to impress a client, and who was trying to salvage a marriage. Then Julian Croft walked in. He didn't so much enter as conquer. The air temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. The maitre d', a man known for his unflappable poise, straightened his tie with a nervous flick of his wrist. Julian was flanked by 2 younger men in similarly expensive suits, but they were planets orbiting a dying star, their own light extinguished by his gravitational pull. His face was a thundercloud. "The Croft party," he clipped, not bothering to make eye contact with the maitre d'. "We have the corner table, and I trust the sommelier has decanted the 98 Petrus as instructed." "Of course, Mr. Croft. Right this way," the maitre d' said, his voice a little too high. Imani felt a familiar prickle of anxiety as she saw them being led to her section. Table 14, the best table in the house, nestled in a discreet alcove with a panoramic view of the city lights. It was also the most demanding. She took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing her apron. "Just another table," she told herself. "Don't let them dim your light." The first 30 minutes were a masterclass in tension. Julian conducted his business like a military campaign. He didn't speak, he issued decrees. He didn't listen, he dissected arguments for weaknesses. He waved away Imani's attempt to explain the specials with a flick of his wrist that felt like a slap. He treated her as if she were a piece of furniture, an inconvenient necessity. His associates followed his lead, their gazes sliding right past her. She was invisible. It was a feeling she was used to, a cloak she usually wore for protection. But tonight, under the sheer force of his disdain, it felt thin and threadbare. She moved with practiced, silent grace, refilling bread baskets, clearing away plates, ensuring their wine glasses were never less than half full. The conversation at the table was brutal, a hostile takeover it seemed. Julian was eviscerating the other party's proposal, his voice a low, cutting monotone. "Their projections are based on sentiment, not data," he was saying, his hand slicing through the air. It's sloppy, it's weak, and I will not have my name attached to weakness. It was then that the world slowed to a crawl. Imani approached with the crystal water pitcher, its sides beaded with condensation. Julian was leaning forward, his focus entirely on his associate across the table, his right hand gesticulating emphatically to underscore his point. This is the final offer. They either accept the terms as they stand, or we liquidate everything. There is no middle ground. There is negotiation. There is. His hand shot back just as Imani leaned in to pour. The back of his knuckles connected with her wrist. It wasn't hard, but it was enough. Her grip faltered for a microsecond. A small splash of ice-cold water, no more than a tablespoon, arched through the air and landed squarely on the sleeve of his dark, immaculate suit jacket. Silence. The associate stopped talking mid-sentence. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Julian looked down at the dark spot on his sleeve as if he'd been shot. The fabric, a fine Italian wool, was already absorbing the moisture, creating a small, dark blemish on the otherwise perfect garment. It was a disruption, a flaw in his controlled universe, an unforgivable error. He lifted his head, and his eyes, cold and gray as a winter sea, found Imani's. The polite, dismissive mask was gone. What lay beneath was pure, unadulterated rage. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the marble floor, and stood. The entire restaurant, which had been humming with quiet conversation, fell utterly silent. Every diner, every staff member turned to look. "Are you an absolute imbecile?" Julian's voice wasn't a yell, not yet. It was something far worse, a blade of ice, honed to a razor's edge that cut through the silence and aimed directly for her throat. Imani froze, the heavy pitcher suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Her training, her instincts, her very survival in this job screamed at her to apologize, to grovel, to abase herself. "I'm so sorry, sir. It was my fault. Please forgive me." The words were on her tongue, but he wasn't finished. He took a step toward her, his frame towering over hers. Now his voice rose, each word a hammer blow. "Do you have any idea what this suit costs? Of course you don't. It's probably more than you make in a year. I come here for excellence, for perfection, and I get this clumsiness, this incompetence." He was leaning closer now, his face contorted. He pointed a finger at her. "I want you fired. Do you hear me? Fired. You are a disgrace to this establishment, and you will not serve another table here again." The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She could feel the stares of 200 people burning into her back. Her manager, a perpetually panicked man named Philip, was scurrying toward them, his face pale. She should cry. She should be terrified. But she wasn't. Because, as he leaned in, his face twisted in that particular sneer of fury. She saw it. A tiny blue vein pulsing faintly on his right temple, just beside his hairline. A little thunderbolt of anger she had once known better than her own reflection. And in that instant, 20 years of carefully constructed walls crumbled to dust. He wasn't Julian Croft, the billionaire terror. He wasn't a monster in a suit. He was just him. She didn't whisper. She didn't shout. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried across the cavernous, silent room with devastating precision. She looked him directly in the eye, and the ghost of a little girl with a gap-toothed smile spoke through her. "You still get that little vein in your forehead when you're angry, don't you, Daddy?" The sound that followed was the sound of a universe breaking. Julian Croft's rage didn't just vanish, it was annihilated, imploding in on itself, leaving a vacuum of pure, horrified shock. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a waxy, sickly white. His jaw, which had been clenched in fury, went slack. His eyes, once so full of fire, were now wide with a dawning, soul-shattering terror. It was the look of a man who had just seen a ghost walk through a wall. The two associates stared, their mouths agape. Philip, the manager, stopped dead in his tracks, his arms still outstretched. The single word, "Daddy," hung in the air, an impossible, earth-shattering sound in the opulent temple of Aria. And in the ringing silence that followed, Julian Croft looked at the black waitress he had just tried to destroy and saw, for the first time in 2 decades, the face of his daughter. The silence that followed Imani's question was not empty. It was a dense, suffocating thing, filled with the unsaid, the unthinkable. Every patron in Aria was frozen, forks halfway to their mouths, conversations dead on their lips. The world had tilted on its axis, and Julian Croft was at the epicenter of the quake. For a man who orchestrated his life with the precision of a surgeon, this was an amputation without anesthesia. His mind, usually a fortress of cold logic and calculated moves, was a maelstrom. The face of the waitress, Imani, a voice from a lifetime ago whispered, swam before his eyes, superimposed over the image of a giggling 8-year-old on a tire swing. The same dark, intelligent eyes, the same determined set of her jaw, the same way she stood her ground, even when she was small, never backing down. It was impossible. It couldn't be her. He had made sure of that. He had paid fortunes, signed papers, and burned bridges to ensure that part of his life was dead and buried. His first instinct, the one honed by decades of corporate warfare and personal denial, was to attack, to crush the anomaly. "What did you say?" he hissed, his voice a ragged, broken thing. It was meant to be a threat, a dismissal, but it came out as a plea, a desperate hope that he had misheard. Imani's composure was a marvel. Inside, her heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs. Her legs trembled, and the pitcher in her hand felt impossibly heavy. She had thrown a grenade into the center of her own life, and she had no idea what the fallout would be. But seeing him, seeing that familiar flash of anger, had unlocked a part of her she'd kept chained for 20 years. A part that was tired of being invisible. She didn't repeat the word. She didn't need to. She simply held his gaze, her expression unreadable. It was not a look of accusation or longing. It was a statement of fact. I am here. You are here. This is the truth. Julian's associates, 2 ambitious young men named Peterson and Clark, exchanged a look of pure panic. This was a career-ending catastrophe unfolding in real time. Peterson, the bolder of the two, tried to intervene. "Mr. Croft, she's clearly delusional. Security should—" "Shut up," Julian snapped, not taking his eyes off Imani. Philip, the manager, finally found his feet. He rushed to Julian's side, his hands fluttering nervously. "Mr. Croft, sir, I am so sorry. This is unacceptable. This employee, she's clearly unwell. We will handle this immediately. Your meal, everything is on the house. Please allow me to escort you to a private room." Julian waved him away with a violent, dismissive gesture, his eyes still locked on Imani. He was resisting. He was fighting it with every fiber of his being. This woman was a stranger, a troublemaker, a nobody looking for a payday. His mind scrambled for a logical explanation. It was a setup, a con. Someone had dug into his past, found a weakness, and was exploiting it. Yes, that had to be it. It was a shakedown. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice low and guttural. "Who are you working for? How much do they want?" The accusation was so far from the truth, so deeply rooted in his own cynical world, that it almost made Imani laugh. The sound that escaped her lips was not one of humor, but of a profound, weary sadness. "No one sent me," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm working for myself. I'm trying to pay for my mother's medication." The mention of her mother was another blow. Lila. The name echoed in the vast, empty chambers of his heart. Lila, the woman he had once loved with a ferocious intensity, the woman he had abandoned. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders, but a flinch nonetheless. He had to get out. He had to reassert control. The stares of the other diners were like physical blows. He could feel his reputation, his carefully constructed persona, cracking like thin ice. He turned away from her, a sharp, jerky movement, and addressed his associates. "The meeting is over. We're leaving." He strode toward the exit, his back ramrod straight, not looking back. He was a king fleeing his own throne room. Peterson and Clark scrambled to follow, grabbing their briefcases. Julian didn't wait for them. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and out into the cool night air, gulping it down as if he'd been drowning. Inside, the restaurant slowly came back to life, buzzing with hushed, frantic whispers. Every eye was now on Imani. She stood alone in the center of the storm, the crystal pitcher still in her hand. Philip, the manager, approached her, his face a mixture of terror and fury. "What in God's name was that?" he hissed, grabbing her arm. "Do you know who that was? Julian Croft. You are finished. You're fired. Get your things and get out of my restaurant." Imani looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. The fear that should have been there was absent. In its place was a strange, hollow calm. She had spoken her truth. The consequences were just weather, and she had been living in a storm her whole life. "Fine," she said, her voice quiet. She placed the pitcher carefully on a nearby table, her movements deliberate. She untied her apron, the one that had rendered her invisible for so long, and folded it neatly. She laid it on the table next to the pitcher. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the staff exit, her head held high. She could feel the weight of every stare, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. Terribly, terrifyingly seen. The man who had spent 2 decades pretending she didn't exist now knew with absolute certainty that she did. And as she pushed open the door into the grimy back alley, she knew this was not the end. It was the beginning of a war she hadn't asked for, but one she was no longer willing to lose. Have you ever had a moment where speaking a simple truth, no matter the consequences, felt like the only option? Share your experience in the comments. The back alley behind Arya smelled of discarded dreams and stale champagne. Imani leaned against the cool brick wall, the adrenaline from the confrontation draining away, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. The city's symphony of sirens and distant traffic, usually just background noise, felt amplified, each sound grating on her raw nerves. Fired. The word echoed in her mind. One word from him, and her lifeline was cut. How would she explain this to her mother? How would she afford the next refill of her medication? Panic, cold and shark, began to claw at the edges of her enforced calm. She pushed herself off the wall, her body heavy, and began the walk toward the bus stop. Each step felt like a march toward an uncertain, terrifying future. The glittering world of Arya was behind her, a world that had chewed her up and spit her out. She was back in the shadows, where she had always been. Meanwhile, Julian Croft's limousine was a silent, leather-lined prison. He sat stiffly on one side, staring unseeing at the city lights blurring past the tinted window. Peterson and Clark sat opposite him, their discomfort a palpable entity in the enclosed space. They dared not speak. The air was thick with their boss's silent, volcanic fury. Julian's mind was a frantic battlefield. It's a lie, a trick, a scam. The words were his shield, his mantra of denial. But the image of her face, the quiet certainty in her eyes, kept punching through his defenses. Daddy. The word was a phantom limb, an ache from a part of him he'd amputated long ago. He hadn't heard that word in 20 years. Not since the day he packed a bag, signed away his rights, and walked out of a small apartment in Queens, convincing himself it was for the best. He was toxic then, a broke, angry man spiraling into oblivion. He had told himself he was saving them from him. He'd left Leela enough money to start over, with the promise of more if she never contacted him again. It was a clean break, a surgical removal of his own heart. He'd rebuilt himself from the ashes of that man, constructing a new identity from steel, glass, and bearer bonds. Julian Croft wasn't a father. He wasn't a husband. He was a market force, a name in the Wall Street Journal. That girl in the restaurant, she was a threat to that entire construction. "Reynolds," he barked into the car's intercom, "turn the car around." His associates looked up. "Sir?" Clark ventured. "Are you deaf? I said turn the car around, Julian repeated, his voice dangerously low. He wasn't going back to the restaurant. He was going to find her. He had to. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about damage control. He needed to confront this woman, this ghost, on his own terms. He would find out her angle, write a check, and make her disappear, permanently this time. It was just another transaction. The limousine executed a smooth, almost silent U-turn, heading back toward Arya. Julian instructed his driver to circle the block. She'll have left through the back. She'll be heading for public transport. Find her. Imani was just a block from the bus stop when the long, black limousine slid to a halt beside her, its sleek form an alien presence on the gritty sidewalk. The back window glided down with a soft whir. She stopped, her body tensing. She expected to see the gloating face of a lackey, or perhaps a lawyer ready to serve her with a restraining order. Instead, she saw him. Julian Croft sat alone in the back, the dim interior lights casting his face in harsh shadows. His expression was no longer enraged. It was something far more complex and unsettling, a mask of cold, brittle control. "Get in the car," he said. It wasn't a request. Imani stared at him, her heart pounding. The instinct to run was overwhelming. This man had the power to ruin her, to crush her completely. Getting into that car felt like stepping into a lion's cage. But then she thought of her mother, of the prescriptions, of the word fired. What did she have left to lose? Maybe this was her one chance to get something. Not a father, not an apology, but something. "Why?" she asked, her voice surprisingly firm. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He was not used to being questioned. "Because I have questions for you, and you will answer them." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook and a pen. "Get in, and this can be over quickly." The sight of the checkbook solidified her resolve. He thought he could buy her silence, just as he had bought her mother's 20 years ago. The anger she hadn't felt in the restaurant began to smolder. She walked to the car door, but she didn't open it. She leaned down, her face level with his. "I'm not getting in your car," she said, her voice low and even. "You want to talk? You can talk to me right here." It was then that the first fat drops of rain began to fall, a sudden, unexpected downpour that had not been in the forecast. Within seconds, it was a deluge, the sky opening up and unleashing a torrent. The rain plastered Imani's thin uniform to her skin, soaking her hair and running in rivulets down her face. She didn't move. She just stood there, dripping and defiant. Julian stared at her, caught off guard. He couldn't conduct this negotiation on a public street in a rainstorm. It was undignified, uncontrolled. People were starting to stare, the billionaire in his limousine and the drenched waitress on the sidewalk. "Don't be ridiculous. Get in the car," he repeated, his voice laced with frustration. "No," she said simply. The rain was coming down in sheets now. Thunder rumbled overhead. His driver, Reynolds, spoke through the intercom. "Sir, the street is beginning to flood. We should move." Julian was trapped. Circumstances, the weather, her stubbornness, had forced his hand. He was losing control. He looked at her shivering form, at the water dripping from her chin, at the unwavering resolve in her eyes. For a split second, he saw not a con artist, but a girl standing in the rain, refusing to be dismissed. "Fine," he snarled. He spoke into the intercom. "Reynolds, is there a cafe or something nearby? Somewhere quiet." "There's a small all-night diner 2 blocks from here, sir. It won't be to your usual standards." "Just go," Julian commanded. He looked back at Imani. 2 blocks. The Starlight Diner. "I will meet you there. If you're not there in 5 minutes, I'm leaving, and you will regret it." The window slid up, sealing him back in his silent, luxurious world. The limousine pulled away from the curb, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. Imani stood alone in the downpour, trembling from the cold and the sheer audacity of what she had just done. She had refused him. She had forced him, the great Julian Croft, to meet her on her terms. In a diner, a place from her world, not his. Wiping the rain from her eyes with a shaking hand, she began to walk, the 2 blocks feeling like a mile. She was being forced into a room with the man who had shattered her life, bound to him by a past he wanted to erase and a future she desperately needed to secure. She didn't know what would happen in that diner, but she knew she was no longer just the waitress. She was his daughter, and tonight he would finally have to look at her. Circumstances have forced them into a reluctant, temporary proximity, setting the stage for deeper revelations. The Starlight Diner was an island of warm, greasy light in the rain-slicked darkness. Its neon sign, with a sputtering S, cast a pinkish glow on the wet pavement. Inside, it smelled of burnt coffee, frying bacon, and decades of quiet desperation. The vinyl on the booth seats was cracked, the chrome trim was dull, and the air was filled with the low murmur of the overnight radio. It was the antithesis of Julian's world, a place he hadn't set foot in since he was a different man entirely. Imani was already there, huddled in a corner booth. She had taken off her soaked uniform jacket, leaving her in the thin white blouse underneath. Her hair was still damp, and she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off a chill that was more than just physical. She'd ordered a cup of tea, and her hands were wrapped around the thick ceramic mug, absorbing its warmth. She watched the door, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety and anticipation. When Julian walked in, he looked like a wolf that had wandered into a petting zoo. His suit, though damp at the shoulders, was a declaration of wealth and power that was utterly alien to the space. The few other patrons, a cab driver, a couple of night shift workers, looked up, their gazes lingering on him. He ignored them, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Imani. He strode to her booth and slid onto the vinyl seat opposite her without a word. The springs groaned in protest. He placed his hands flat on the Formica tabletop, as if to anchor himself. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his jaw tight, his shoulders rigid. A waitress with a tired face and a kind smile approached. "Can I get you something, hun?" she asked Julian. "Nothing," he clipped, his eyes still fixed on Imani. The waitress shrugged and walked away. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Imani took a slow sip of her tea, the clink of the mug against her tea, the only sound. She would not speak first. This was his meeting. Finally, he broke. "I'm going to ask you again," he said, his voice a low, controlled rumble. "Who are you working with? What is your angle?" Imani looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without the filter of a restaurant uniform or a car window. She saw the lines etched around his eyes, the flecks of gray at his temples. He looked older, more tired than she had imagined. The monster from her childhood memories was just a man, a rich, powerful, and deeply unhappy man. "There is no angle," she said softly. "My angle is that I lost my job tonight because you couldn't handle a drop of water on your suit. My angle is that my mother needs medication that I now have no way of paying for." "Your mother?" he asked, a carefully constructed wall of indifference in his voice. "Lila is, well..." The casual, almost dismissive way he said her name sent a fresh wave of anger through Imani. "You don't get to ask about her," she said, her voice sharp. "You lost that right 20 years ago. But since you asked, no, she's not well. Her arthritis is so bad, some days she can't get out of bed. She needs a new treatment, but it's expensive. So I work 60 hours a week serving people like you so she can have some small measure of comfort in her life, the life you left her with." Julian flinched. He reached for his checkbook again, placing it on the table between them like a weapon. "How much?" Imani looked at the checkbook, then back at his face. "You think that's the answer to everything, don't you? A check. You write a check and the problem goes away. You wrote my mother a check to make her go away. Now you want to write me one?" "It's a practical solution to a practical problem," he said, his voice strained. "You need money. I have it. Name a price." "There is no price," Imani shot back, her voice rising. "What is the price for a father? What's the going rate for the last 20 years? For every birthday you missed? For my high school graduation? For all the nights my mother cried herself to sleep because the man she loved vanished and told her she was better off without him?" The words hit him like physical blows. He recoiled, his face paling. "You know nothing about it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I did what I had to do. I was no good for either of you. I was drowning. I would have pulled you both down with me." "You didn't give us a choice," Imani's voice cracked, the raw emotion she'd held back for so long finally breaking through. "You just disappeared. One day you were there, teaching me how to ride a bike, and the next, you were gone, a ghost. Do you have any idea what that does to a child? To think that they were so unlovable that their own father would just leave?" Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and silent. She didn't bother to wipe them away. They were a testament to 2 decades of pain. Julian stared at her, his carefully constructed walls crumbling. The confident billionaire was gone, replaced by a man haunted by his own past. He saw the little girl he had left behind, her face now etched with the struggles of a life he had forced upon her. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his chest. His gaze dropped to her wrist, where her hand rested on the table. A thin, silver chain was clasped around it. It was a delicate, simple bracelet, almost childlike. On it was a single, tiny charm, a small, intricately carved star. His breath caught in his throat. His blood ran cold. He felt the world tilt again, more violently this time. He remembered a sunny afternoon in a park. He was pushing an 8-year-old Imani on a swing. For her birthday, he had saved up for weeks to buy her that exact bracelet from a small jewelry shop. It was all he could afford. He remembered fastening it around her tiny wrist. She had held it up to the light, her eyes wide with wonder. "A star, Daddy," she had said, her voice full of childish delight, "so I can always make a wish." He had knelt down in front of her. "And what are you going to wish for, my little star?" She had thrown her arms around his neck, her small body warm against his. "I wish you'll never, ever leave me." The memory hit him with the force of a physical impact. It was a direct connection to the man he used to be, to the love he had thrown away. He looked from the bracelet on her adult wrist back to her tear-streaked face. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a scam. This was his daughter, his Imani, his little star, and he had broken his promise. He couldn't speak. The checkbook on the table seemed like a profane object, an insult to the sacredness of the memory. All the money in the world, all the power, all the control, it was all worthless. It was dust. He had traded that little girl's love for a kingdom of ashes. The truth, stark and undeniable, was finally unveiled, not by a DNA test or a legal document, but by a cheap silver bracelet and a ghost of a promise made on a summer's day. The Starlight Diner, moments before a stage for confrontation, was now a pocket of profound, fragile silence. The sputtering neon sign outside seemed to hum in time with the frantic beating of Julian's heart. The sight of the bracelet had disarmed him completely, stripping away 20 years of carefully layered denial. The rage, the suspicion, the cold calculation, it all evaporated, leaving behind a raw, aching vulnerability he hadn't felt in decades. Imani, seeing the radical shift in his expression, watched him, her tears subsiding. The anger that had fueled her had given way to a cautious, wary curiosity. His face, once a mask of granite, was now shattered. She saw not the billionaire who had tried to fire her, but a man drowning in a memory. "I remember," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Your 8th birthday, in Cunningham Park." Imani's breath hitched. He remembered. That small, specific detail, a detail only they could share, was more powerful than any apology. It was a bridge across the chasm of 20 years. "You told me it was my lucky star," she said softly, her fingers tracing the small charm on her wrist. "I've never taken it off." "I didn't," he started, then trailed off, shaking his head. "I convinced myself you would have forgotten. that it would be easier if you did. For the first time, he looked at her not as a problem to be solved, but as a person, his daughter. The pain he had caused was written on her face, in the slight downward turn of her mouth, in the weary strength in her eyes. The guilt was suffocating. I am sorry," he said. The words felt foreign and clumsy on his tongue. He was a man who demanded apologies, not one who gave them. For what happened tonight, at the restaurant, there is no excuse for my behavior. It wasn't the apology she had dreamed of for 20 years, the one that would explain everything, that would heal every wound. But it was a start. It was a crack in the fortress. "Why?" she asked, the question soft but insistent. Not why did you yell at me, but the bigger why, the one that had haunted her entire life. Why did you leave? Julian looked down at his hands on the table. They were strong, manicured hands that signed multi-million-dollar deals, but at that moment, they looked helpless. "I was a mess, Imani," he said, the honesty costing him dearly. "I was failing at everything. My business had gone bankrupt, I was drinking too much, I was angry at the world. Every time I looked at you and your mother, I saw my own failure. I saw the life I couldn't give you. I thought you'd be better off without me, that I was a poison, and the only way to save you was to cut myself out of your lives." He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a profound, gut-wrenching shame. It was the coward's way out. "I told myself it was for you, but it was for me. I couldn't stand to see you watch me fail." Imani listened, her heart aching. For all her life, she had believed he left because she wasn't enough. To hear that he left because he felt he wasn't enough was a paradigm shift that left her reeling. It didn't excuse the pain, but it reframed it. It wasn't about a lack of love, but a surplus of shame. "We would have loved you anyway," she whispered. "Broke, angry, whatever. We would have loved you." A single tear traced a path down Julian's weathered cheek. He didn't wipe it away. In the greasy, fluorescent light of the diner, it was a glistening admission of a lifetime of regret. The tired waitress returned, placing a cup of coffee in front of Julian without being asked. "You look like you could use it," she said gently, then walked away. Julian stared at the coffee. He wrapped his hands around the mug, mirroring Imani's earlier gesture. For a long moment, they just sat there, two strangers connected by blood and a shared tragedy, finding a fragile truce in the warmth of cheap ceramic mugs. A ghost of a smile touched Imani's lips. It was a sad, wry smile. "You know," she said, her voice a little lighter, "for years, I used to imagine what I would say to you if I ever saw you again. I had all these big, dramatic speeches planned. I was going to be so cold, so cutting. I was going to make you hurt as much as I did." "And?" Julian asked, his voice raw. "And then you yelled at me about a water stain," she said, and a small, genuine laugh escaped her. It was a beautiful sound in the quiet diner. It was all so ridiculous, so much smaller than the drama I had in my head. Julian felt the corner of his own mouth twitch. "I have a tendency to overreact to small imperfections." "You don't say," she deadpanned, and the shared, momentary humor was a balm. It was a small flicker of light in the darkness. In that moment, they weren't a billionaire and a waitress. They were a father and a daughter, sharing a private joke 20 years in the making. The rain had softened to a gentle patter against the diner window. The city outside was quiet, sleeping. Inside, in their small booth, a fragile bond was forming. It was not forgiveness. It was not a solution. It was something far more delicate. It was a shared moment of peace, of safety, of raw, unvarnished truth. They talked more, not about the pain of the past, but about the small things. She told him about her mother's garden on their tiny apartment balcony, how she could make anything grow. He told her, haltingly, about the one time he'd tried to take a vacation and had been so bored he'd flown home after 2 days to close a deal. They were discovering each other, piece by piece. For the first time, Julian felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with a successful merger or a rising stock price. It was a feeling he had long ago forgotten. It felt like coming home. Healing, it seemed, was not impossible. But the foundation of their new connection was built on the rubble of the past, and it was about to be tested. What does it truly mean to forgive someone who has hurt you deeply? Is it about absolving them, or is it about freeing yourself? Share your perspective in the comments. The first hint of dawn was painting the New York sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. The rain had stopped. Inside the Starlight Diner, the bubble of fragile peace that had enveloped Julian and Imani was about to burst. The coffee had grown cold in their mugs. They had talked for hours, the conversation weaving between past and present, creating a tentative, shimmering thread between them. For the first time, Julian felt the ice around his heart begin to melt. He saw a future, a terrifying, uncharted, but undeniably hopeful one, where he could begin to repair the damage he had caused. He knew what he had to do. It had to be more than just money, more than a check. It had to be a real, tangible act of care. "Imani," he began, his voice earnest, full of a resolve he hadn't felt in years. "I want to help. With your mother. The best doctors, the best treatments, whatever she needs. I'll take care of everything. And you don't have to work at places like Aria ever again. I can set you up, a trust fund, help you start a business, go back to school, whatever you want. It's the least I can do." He said it with the best of intentions. In his world, this was how you showed you cared. You solved problems with resources. You removed obstacles. He looked at her, expecting to see relief, gratitude, perhaps even joy. Instead, he saw the warmth in her eyes instantly extinguish, replaced by a cold, familiar disappointment. Her face hardened, the soft lines of their recent connection tightening into a mask of hurt. "You still don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Julian, what? I'm trying to help. I'm trying to fix this." "You're not trying to fix this," she countered, her voice gaining a sharp, wounded edge. "You're trying to buy this. You're doing the exact same thing you did 20 years ago. You're throwing money at the problem so you don't have to deal with the messy, inconvenient reality of it. You want to pay for my mother's doctors so you don't have to sit with her, hold her hand, and see the pain you caused. You want to set me up with a trust fund so I become a neat, tidy line item in your financial portfolio called daughter, not a person who might factually need you." The accusations struck him as deeply unfair. He was trying to do the right thing, the only way he knew how. "That's not true. I'm trying to give you a better life, the life you should have had. I didn't need a better life." Imani's voice cracked, and she slammed her palm down on the table, making the cold mugs jump. "I needed a father. I needed you, not your money. My mother didn't need your money. She needed the man she loved. You think you can just write a check and erase 20 years of absence? 20 years of me wondering what was so wrong with me that you had to leave? You think you can just pay to have your guilt washed away?" Her words were knives, and they found every single one of his insecurities. His own deep-seated fear was that he was unlovable, that his only value lay in his wealth. She was confirming his worst fear. The fragile vulnerability he had allowed himself to feel was suddenly a liability. His old defenses, the armor of pride and anger, slammed back into place. "You're being naive," he spat, his voice turning cold and cruel. He was hurt, and he lashed out. "You talk about love and presence as if they pay the bills. I am offering you security, a future without struggle, and you're throwing it back in my face because it's not wrapped in a pretty, sentimental bow. What do you want from me? Do you want me to move into your tiny apartment and pretend to be the broke, pathetic man I was? That's the man who left you. This man," he said, gesturing to his expensive suit, "is the one who can actually do something for you. But it's not good enough. Nothing would ever be good enough, would it?" The blow landed, calling her life, her home, tiny, calling the father she remembered pathetic. It was a deliberate, vicious cruelty designed to wound. And it worked. The hope that had flickered in her heart was crushed, ground into dust under the heel of his pride. "You're right," she said, her voice now devoid of all emotion. It was a flat, dead thing. She stood up, her movements stiff. "Nothing you could offer would ever be good enough, because the one thing we ever needed from you was the one thing you were, and still are, incapable of giving: your heart." She reached into her purse and pulled out a few crumpled dollar bills, placing them on the table to cover her tea. It was a final, proud gesture, a statement. "I don't need your money." "I was wrong to think you could change," she said, looking down at him, her eyes filled with a profound, soul-deep sorrow. "You're not a ghost, you're a black hole, and you will always be alone." She turned and walked out of the diner, leaving him sitting in the booth, the crumpled dollar bills a testament to his colossal failure. He watched her go, a storm of shame, anger, and regret raging inside him. He had been so close. He had held a real, fragile piece of hope in his hands, and in his arrogance, in his fear, he had clenched his fist and crushed it into nothing. The bond, so recently formed, was not just broken, it was shattered. He looked around the empty diner, at the cold coffee, at the first rays of morning light slanting through the window. He had never felt so rich, and he had never felt so utterly, devastatingly bankrupt. The silence she left behind was louder than any argument, and it screamed his greatest fear, that she was right. He was unworthy of connection, and he was destined to be alone. A misunderstanding rooted in their core flaws has shattered their bond, marking the story's lowest emotional point. The penthouse was no longer a sanctuary of control, it was a mausoleum. The curated silence that Julian had once found so soothing now felt accusatory, amplifying the echo of Imani's final words: "You will always be alone." He stood in the center of the vast living room, the city waking up below him, but he felt completely detached, as if watching the world from behind a thick pane of glass. The suit he wore, a symbol of his power and success, felt like a costume, a hollow shell. He had spent the hours since she left pacing, a caged animal in his own gilded prison. His mind replayed their conversation in the diner on a torturous loop. He dissected every word, every nuance. At first, pride had been his shield. She was being unreasonable, ungrateful, sentimental. But the shield was weak, and the truth kept piercing it. "You think you can just pay to have your guilt washed away?" The question haunted him. Was that what he had been trying to do? He sank onto the edge of a minimalist sofa, the plush leather offering no comfort. He ran his hands over his face, the exhaustion not just physical, but spiritual. He had spent his entire adult life equating worth with wealth. It was the only metric he understood. When his first business failed, he hadn't just lost money, he had lost his identity. He had felt worthless. And in his shame, he had run away from the two people who would have loved him for nothing. Now, presented with a second chance, he had made the exact same mistake. He had offered money when he should have offered himself. He had seen their needs, for a doctor, for a stable life, as problems to be solved with a wire transfer. He had failed to see the deeper, more profound need, the need for a father's presence, for a husband's remorse, the need for love. His eyes drifted again to the silver frame on his desk, still turned to the wall. Slowly, as if in a trance, he walked over to it. His hand trembled as he reached for it, his fingers brushing away a thin layer of dust. He turned it around. The photo was faded, but the memory was sharp. Imani, a little girl with a brilliant, gap-toothed grin, her face alight with pure joy. And him, the younger version of himself, looking down at her with an expression of such open, unguarded love that it stole the breath from his lungs. He didn't recognize that man anymore. That man hadn't been rich. That man hadn't been powerful. But that man had been happy. He had been loved. What was the point of owning the world if he had forfeited his soul to get it? He was at a precipice. He could retreat back into his fortress of wealth, nurse his wounded pride, and let her go for a second time. He could convince himself she was right, that he was incapable of real connection, and live out his days in sterile, lonely splendor. That was the easy choice, the coward's choice, the choice he had made once before. Or he could make a different choice. He could choose vulnerability over pride, truth over avoidance. It was terrifying. It meant admitting he was wrong, not just about the diner, but about everything for the last 20 years. It meant tearing down the entire edifice of Julian Croft, the billionaire, to find the man, the father, buried beneath. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was Reynolds, his assistant. "Meeting with the board is confirmed for 9 a.m., sir." The machinery of his life was moving on, expecting him to fall in line. For the first time, he felt the urge to let it all go, to let it all burn. He looked at the photo of the smiling girl, then at his own reflection in the dark glass of the phone screen. He saw a lonely, broken man. He had a choice, pride or his daughter. He picked up the phone, his thumb hovering over his assistant's name. Then, with a decisive movement, he swiped past it and opened his call log. Her number wasn't there. He had never asked for it. Of course he hadn't. He had assumed he could summon her at will. The arrogance of it made him sick. How could he find her? The restaurant. But she was fired. He had made sure of that. Panic began to set in. Had he already lost her again, just hours after finding her? He thought frantically. Her manager, Philip. He had the man's number somewhere. He scrolled through his contacts, his heart pounding. There. He pressed the call button before he could lose his nerve. It was barely 7 a.m. Philip answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep and immediate panic. "Mr. Croft, sir, is everything all right?" "I need the waitress's contact information," Julian said, his voice raw. "Imani Wallace, I need her address." There was a confused pause. "Sir, as per your instructions last night, her employment was terminated. Her file is—" "I don't care about her file." Julian's voice was a roar of desperation, not anger. "I need to find her, now. It is the most important thing you will ever do for me. Find her address." Imani sat at the small, worn kitchen table in her apartment, the untouched cup of tea in front of her, a bitter reminder of the diner. She hadn't slept. She had crept in, careful not to wake her mother, and had been sitting in the quiet dimness of the kitchen ever since. The hope she had foolishly allowed to bloom in her heart had been poisoned at the root. He was who he was, a man who built walls of money and power and who would never, ever let anyone inside. The sliver of a bond they had formed now felt like a cruel joke. She had opened up her deepest wounds to him, and he had tried to put a gold-plated bandage on them. The pain was worse now than it had been before. Before, he was a ghost, a mystery. Now, he was a real, tangible disappointment. Her mother's door creaked open. Leela stood there, leaning on her walker, her face etched with concern. She must have heard her come in. "Imani, baby, what's wrong? You're home early." Imani looked up at her mother, and the dam broke. Sobs racked her body, the kind of deep, gut-wrenching sobs she hadn't allowed herself since she was a child. "I saw him, Mama," she choked out. "I saw him." Leela's eyes widened. She shuffled over as quickly as she could, her hand coming to rest on Imani's shaking shoulders. She didn't need to ask who he was. There was only one him. She just stood there, her presence a warm, comforting weight, letting her daughter grieve the man who had managed to break her heart all over again. There was a knock at the door. Not a loud, authoritative knock, but a soft, hesitant one, tentative. Imani looked up, her face streaked with tears. Who could that be? "Probably just Mrs. Rodriguez asking for sugar," Leela said, though the early hour made it unlikely. She shuffled toward the door. "I'll get it." "Be careful, Mama," Imani whispered. Leela unlocked the 3 deadbolts and opened the door a crack, the security chain still in place. Standing in the hallway of their humble Bronx apartment building, looking utterly and completely out of place, was Julian Croft. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. His tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and his face was a portrait of raw, desperate humility. He looked not at Leela, but past her, his gaze searching for Imani. His eyes found hers across the small room. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The choice was written all over his face. He had chosen vulnerability. He had chosen truth. He had chosen her. Now she had a choice to make. She could slam the door, cementing the wall between them forever. She could cling to her hurt and her pride, or she could take the terrifying, uncertain step of letting him in. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was the hardest choice of her life. The hallway of the Bronx apartment building became the most important room in the world. The air was thick with 20 years of unspoken words, of pain, of longing. Leela stood at the door, her hand frozen on the knob, her eyes wide as she stared at the ghost from her past. Julian stood on the welcome mat, stripped of all his power, all his wealth. He was just a man, his heart laid bare, his gaze fixed on the daughter he had failed. And Imani sat at the kitchen table, the entire world narrowing to this single, pivotal moment. Her mind screamed at her to protect herself. Slam the door. Don't let him in. He'll only hurt you again. The wound from the diner was still raw, still bleeding. Pride, her oldest and most loyal companion, urged her to turn away. But then she looked at his face. The arrogance was gone. The coldness was gone. In their place was a look of profound, terrified hope. It was the face of a man who had torn down his own fortress and was standing in the rubble, waiting to see if he would be left there alone. It was the face of a man who had finally, truly chosen them. And in his eyes, she saw an echo of the father from the photograph. The one with the unguarded, loving smile. Slowly, she pushed her chair back. The scrape of the legs against the linoleum floor was a deafening sound in the silent apartment. She stood up. Leela watched her, her expression unreadable, waiting for her daughter's lead. Imani walked toward the door. Each step was a battle against a lifetime of self-preservation. She stopped beside her mother, her hand covering Leela's on the door. Her fingers were trembling. She looked through the crack, directly at Julian. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. Julian's throat worked. He didn't offer money. He didn't offer solutions. He offered the only thing he had left, the truth. "Because you were right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "About everything. In the diner, I was a coward. I was scared. When you rejected my money, you rejected the only thing I thought made me worthy, and it terrified me. So I tried to hurt you. It was a monstrous thing to do, and I am so, so sorry." He took a shaky breath, his eyes pleading. "I don't want to be a black hole. I don't want to be alone. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be a father, but I want to learn, if you'll let me. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I haven't earned it. I'm just asking for a chance to start over, not with a checkbook, just with me." He gestured helplessly at himself, a man in a rumpled shirt, standing in a hallway, asking for permission to enter a life he had thrown away. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. It was raw, unpracticed, and utterly real. It was everything she had ever wanted to hear. Imani looked at her mother. Leela's eyes were glistening with tears, but she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was Imani's decision. Imani's gaze returned to Julian. The war inside her ceased. In its place, a quiet, tentative peace began to bloom. She took a deep breath and slid the security chain from its lock. The metallic click was a sound of surrender, of possibility. She pulled the door open. Julian stood there, vulnerable, exposed. He didn't move. He waited. "My mother's arthritis, it's worst in the mornings," Imani said softly. "The kettle is on the stove. She likes her tea with honey. It wasn't an I forgive you. It wasn't an I love you. It was an invitation. It was a beginning. It was a task. A small, simple act of care. It was a test." A wave of overwhelming relief washed over Julian's face. Tears welled in his eyes, and this time he let them fall without shame. He nodded, a jerky, emotional movement. "Honey," he repeated, the word grounding him. "Okay." He stepped across the threshold, out of the hallway and into their life. The apartment was small, but it was filled with a warmth his penthouse had never known. The smell of old books and brewing tea, the sight of thriving plants on the windowsill, the feeling of home. He looked at Leela, the woman he had loved and left. "Leela," he breathed, his voice full of a regret so vast it was almost a physical presence. Leela looked at him, her expression a complex tapestry of past hurt and present reality. "You got old, Julian," she said, her voice raspy. But there was no malice in it. It was just a fact, a statement of time lost. Julian gave a wet, humorous laugh. "Yeah, I did." He walked past them, into the small, immaculate kitchen. He felt clumsy, an intruder. He saw the kettle, the box of tea bags, the jar of honey with a small, bear-shaped dispenser. He fumbled with the cabinet, looking for a mug. Imani came and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching him. She saw his expensive, manicured hands, the hands that commanded boardrooms, trembling as they tried to simply make a cup of tea. He looked up and saw her watching, a look of profound shame on his face for his own incompetence at this simple human task. And then she did something that surprised them both. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She walked over to the cabinet, took down her mother's favorite mug, a chipped one with a picture of a cartoon bluebird on it, and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed. The contact was electric, a jolt of connection. "She likes it to steep for 3 minutes," Imani said quietly. He nodded, taking the mug. 3 minutes. As he stood by the stove, waiting for the water to boil, he looked around the kitchen. He saw a framed photo on the counter, one he had never seen before. It was Imani at her high school graduation, wearing a cap and gown, holding a diploma. She was smiling, but there was a sadness in her eyes. Standing beside her, beaming with pride, was Leela. There was an empty space on Imani's other side, a space where a father should have been. The cost of his absence captured in a 5x7 frame. He would spend the rest of his life trying to fill that space. When the tea was ready, he carried it carefully, like a sacrament, into the living room. Leela was sitting on the worn sofa. He handed her the mug. She took it, her gaze searching his. "Thank you, Julian," she said softly. He just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He turned to Imani, who was still standing by the kitchen doorway. He didn't know what to say. The silence was filled with 1,000 possibilities. Then Imani looked him in the eye, and her expression was one of quiet, startling grace. She gave him the ghost of the smile he remembered from a tire swing in a park 20 years ago. "Welcome home, Dad." The word, the one she had used as a weapon in the restaurant, was now a gift. It was a pardon. It was a promise. It was everything. Julian Croft, the billionaire, finally broke. He covered his face with his hands and wept, not with the lonely grief of his penthouse, but with the cleansing, hopeful sorrow of a man who had been lost for 20 years and had, against all odds, finally found his way home. Do you believe that true redemption is possible, no matter how great the past mistake? Let us know in the comments if you think a second chance can ever truly heal old wounds.